The gospel was long, so I will be short, relatively speaking. Plus, the words in that gospel so eloquently convey the passion, the suffering, and the death of Jesus Christ in words that I could never match. But I did want to make a few observations in light of what we've been talking about all through this Lent. You know, we've been talking about these 5 steps that we can take to deepen our faith, to grow in our discipleship, to become more like Jesus, to grow closer to God. I'm sure you remember what they are: serving others, tithing and giving, engaging in a Christian community, practicing prayer, and sharing your faith. And what struck me as I was praying over these scriptures for this week, this passion narrative, is that Jesus modeled all of those steps for us, even in his most difficult time, even on his journey to the cross. Right before he entered Jerusalem, he healed a man. He raised a man named Lazarus from the dead. He served him by raising him from the dead. After he entered into the city, he taught day after day in the temple precincts. He served the people by teaching them the truth. Jesus did not just give money, which is what we give when we tithe and give. Jesus gave his whole life. He gave everything to us, his entire existence, his body, blood, soul, and divinity, so that we could live, so that we could have salvation. When Jesus could have isolated himself in pain and worry and fear, when he knew the end of days was coming for him, he instead chose to engage in a Christian community. He gathered his disciples with him and joyfully shared the Passover meal with them. He taught them many things in that meal. And when he went out to pray, he brought the disciples with him. Jesus engaged in a Christian community. Even in his final hours, he knew the importance of being around other people of faith. When he went to the Garden of Gethsemane, he prayed. He fell to the ground and he prayed like any other frightened man would pray. He prayed in his humanity, God, take this suffering away from me. I don't want to go through this. But at the end of that prayer, he modeled for us what the perfect prayer is. He said, but not my will, Father, but your will be done. Jesus also shared his faith. He didn't really need faith. He knew the truth, but he shared the faith even when he was going through his passion and suffering on the cross. For example, when he was arrested and he was in front of the Sanhedrin, the council of Jewish elders, the religious leaders, he testified to the truth about who he was. They asked him if he was the Messiah, the Christ, and he said, I am, which sounds like a fairly straightforward answer. But he went further than the question. In Exodus, the second book of the Bible in the Old Testament, when God introduced himself to Moses, Moses asked him what God's name was, and God said, I am who am. So when Jesus says to the Sanhedrin, the Jewish elders, I am, he's saying, I'm not only the Messiah, I am God. I am the Son of God. That is why the chief priest tore his robes. He thought it was blasphemy. But Jesus was sharing faith. He was teaching the truth. On the cross, he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's not a random line. Yes, in one sense, Jesus, as a man in his humanity, felt in that moment that God had left him, had abandoned him. Where was God in this worst moment of his life, in the worst moment that any of us could ever imagine? Where was God? But Jesus was teaching something from the cross. He was sharing faith. That phrase, my God, why have you forsaken me, comes from Psalm 22, verse 1. And in that culture, when you quoted the first line of a psalm, it called attention to the entire psalm. And as you read through that entire psalm, it begins in desolation, but it ends in triumph, because the one who wrote the psalm, King David, believes that God will give him the victory, knows that God will give him the victory. So even from the cross, as he was drawing his last breath, Jesus shared the truth of the faith, that God would have the final word. And Jesus went through his suffering and death with such courage and obedience to God and humility of heart that even the Roman centurion cried out at the end when Jesus had finally died, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." Even in his last moment, Jesus taught the truth. He shared the faith. Jesus modeled all of these 5 steps for us on his way to Calvary and into his death. You and I have been walking those 5 steps over the last weeks in Lent. As we enter this most sacred season of Holy Week coming up this week, I invite you to offer to God all the progress you've made, all the knowledge you have learned, and all the growth you have experienced. Offer that up to God. Everything you have grown in throughout this Lenten season, offer to God in thanksgiving and to his Son Jesus, who led the way and showed us the way. But most importantly, I invite you this Holy Week to offer your very life as Christ did on the cross. Offer your very life to God, to the glory of God the Father.